Welcome to Dynamics Mechanics, Episode 8, Power Platform Custom Connectors. Thank you for joining me on the Dynamics Mechanics podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Smith, the Dynamics Mechanic. This is the Dynamics 365 Strategy Podcast, where we discuss implementing software systems using the Microsoft Business Applications Platform. It's where I give you the strategies and teach you the techniques I learned in my experience as a delivery architect at Microsoft.
This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And KingswaySoft now fully works with CDS and PowerApps.
So in case you missed it, on January 29th, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, USA, giving a presentation on developing custom connectors for the Power Platform. Now, I would guess that 100% of you did not come to that talk because when I actually presented, I saw a bunch of people with a gaze in their eyes that kind of told me that they probably really had no clue what I was talking about. It was a developer session, but it didn't appear that anybody else got the memo. So you can imagine how that went. But anyway, for this particular presentation, I was originally given a presentation from Ignite. And I don't know if you've ever tried this, but it's really hard to give someone else's presentation. Especially when, it's a different mindset. When you create a presentation, you kind of know the points that you're trying to hit, but then when someone else creates it, it's a little more difficult because you're not exactly, in the same mindset that that person was when they created that presentation. So I kind of, without knowing if this was okay or not, modified the presentation to kind of fit my style and what I wanted to talk about, which was not just about developing custom connectors for the Power Platform, but also some of the architectural and performance things that I saw with the pattern that Microsoft is using for custom connectors. So in this agenda that I had for the presentation, I'm kind of going over kind of the overview of the Power Platform, discussing custom connectors, the connector framework and architecture, and some system architecture considerations, which is kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I said that I modified the presentation. And I asked Joel Lindstrom, who was there as well, if that was okay. He said, "Oh yeah, sure, go ahead." So I think I wasn't going too far over the line by doing this, but I wanted to make the presentation relevant, but also add some of my architectural kind of considerations that I would normally give or have on a project where we might use these things. So the Power Platform is composed of Power BI, PowerApps, and Microsoft Flow. And of course, this is the golden child of Microsoft of, the last year or so. This thing has really developed and blossomed over time, and it's become very powerful. When it comes to the Power Platform, the thing is, for example, when you create a Power App, or you create a Flow, or you create a Power BI dashboard, the thing is, you have to somehow get data in, and, sometimes you want to get data out. And what the connector does is it allows you to develop a custom connection to where, for example, if you have in-house apps or some other third-party service where there's not already a connector, you can go ahead and create that connector for your particular purpose. Or you may find there may be a public connector that's already there. that doesn't exactly suit your needs. Maybe it doesn't encompass the entire API of a particular platform, or you want to somehow enhance it for your particular needs. What we're going to focus on here is custom connectors that work with both PowerApps and Microsoft Flow. Now, these custom connectors currently, at this point, do not just natively work with Power BI, but Microsoft has said they are investing in making that transition seamless. Now, you need to use a little bit of a different way to create a custom BI connector or custom Power BI connector, but that's another story. Now, the first thing is, what is a custom connector? And it's really simple. All it is just a REST API adapter framework that allows the Power Platform to communicate with a third-party API or custom endpoint. And it has to be REST. It has to be a REST endpoint. But basically, you can go in and you can create your own connector. And what you have to do is you have to kind of tell the connector what the data payload that is returned means, and then you can kind of build a set of calls or actions upon that connector. And when you do that, you basically expose those operations to the Power Platform. And then that could be used by either a business analyst or users. Now, some of the reasons why you might do this is, for example, for enterprise development, you might be looking for connectivity to an external service that's currently not supported, which could be most likely internal APIs or even external services. And you may want to add functionality that is not currently provided in a connector that Microsoft has provided. And that could be, for example, the connector that Microsoft provides for, let's say, XYZ service. They may create basically a shallow implementation of that particular connector, and you may want to do more or add some kind of custom functionality to it. So you would be able to go and create your own connector that would effectively be a superset of that. Another reason why you might want to create a connector is if you're a partner or an ISV or independent software vendor. You might want to expand integrations into your application or platform. You can also create a provider that allows customers to make their usage of your platform extensible in order to meet needs that maybe you don't have specifically programmed in your platform, but with the use of a connector in a Microsoft Flow or even a Power App, there may be scenarios that customers will be able to utilize your platform that you probably won't ever specifically create a function for, but this allows the flexibility for customers to use your platform in a lot of different ways. And the other thing is you can create a custom connector and this will increase the exposure and adoption of your platform because you can put it out to be consumable by anybody that is on the Microsoft platform. In an enterprise development use case, for example, you may want to look up reference data in a SQL Server table that's, let's say, on-prem or even in the cloud. You can create a custom connector for app XYZ and point it at, a table or whatever you want to do, and configure this connector to utilize that. Now, there is a SQL Server connector in the Power Platform connectors list. And basically what that does, like I said, is it has to be a RESTful service that you're consuming. And what that adapter does is it kind of puts a RESTful layer over SQL Server so that you can consume that. And then that makes SQL Server available for consumption. You can integrate with third-party apps and service providers. So for example, case in point for me is I had a project once where I had to integrate with Monster, the job service. And they have a RESTful API that you can consume, but we had to do custom coding to consume that API and then parse the results and do all our stuff. Now, in theory, we now could use a custom connector to the Monster platform, and we could have saved ourselves a bit of coding, custom coding that we had to do in order to consume that API. The other thing that's interesting about that particular scenario is that we actually, in that use case, had to log in as the individual users, which was kind of weird because they had to give us their credentials to their personal accounts, and then we had to log in and use their credentials because the consumption was actually on a per user basis, which was like I said, it was very weird because we had to do some weird, funky things for those users to provide us their credentials and make sure they were encrypted. And it was just a big, hairy mess. Now, with the Power Platform, in theory, we could have been able to create this custom connector and have each of the users give the login credentials of their own account to the Power Platform, which then would have authenticated for them. So this search connector would have been nice because in this particular use case, users were looking through the Monster platform for potential leads, sales leads. And instead of us having to do all the work, we probably could have come up with a more creative way with the Power Platform. One of the things that you can do is you can generate custom apps based on things like Excel files, SharePoint lists, Dynamics 365, or even custom APIs. Your apps will be fully able to interact with underlying sources and respect established permissions. So it's not like you create a custom connector and all of a sudden users have admin access to everything they want to do. The security setup that you've configured will still be adhered to. It's just that you're giving access to users to be able to access some other particular data source. You can connect your data to a local, or your connector to a local network through the on-premises data gateway. So basically your connector, once you create your custom connector, it can run either in the cloud or on-prem, which poses an interesting question. How does that work? How does that happen? So, well, okay, let me back up. So with custom connectors and connectors in general for the Power Platform, right now, Microsoft has over 200 cloud services, files, databases, and web APIs that there are connectors for already. And some of these are standard and some of these are premium. The premium connectors, you'll have to have a higher subscription level to be able to utilize those. But you can create your own if that makes sense for you to do, instead of upgrading and basically paying for the premium connectors. That's up to you. You can connect your service with your own security credentials. So like I said, the way the framework kind of works is you provide the connection, right? But the user still has to use their own credentials in order to connect to that service. So the security setup is still intact. You don't have to worry about, like I said, users getting crazy, administrative permissions, unless you do some funky things on the back end. We'll talk about that a little bit later. With custom connectors, you can extend the reach of your application. So for example, let's say you want to consume weather.com, right, their API, and put that in your app, in your Power App. You could create I don't know if weather.com actually has a RESTful API exposed, but if they did, let's just assume they do. You could create that custom connector, hook it up, and then, someone fires up your Power App and, oh, look, it's the weather, right? Great. The first thing that you want to do when you're developing a custom connector is research and understand the target service API. You have to know what kind of result sets that you're going to get back in your JSON. And then from there, you can kind of map out the operations that you want to develop in your custom connector. Now, if you're going to start from scratch, you can go ahead and use something like Fiddler or whatever and get those payloads. And then you have to kind of define what the different elements mean. You can also use OpenAPI/Swagger, Swagger definition, or Postman collection to kind of build out your operations. OpenAPI is kind of a newer standard that's based on Swagger. The third thing that you can do is you can set up your API authentication. There's different ways that you can do that. You can do anonymous, which depending on what you're consuming, maybe that's okay. You can use basic authentication. You can use an API key, or you can use OAuth 2.0, which is only cloud compatible, but it also includes using Azure AD. You can also use Windows authentication when you're operating on-prem. The next step you need to do is define the operations for your connector. So you import the request and response from a sample payload, and you can go ahead and map those out. And then the next step, the last step, is save and test your connector. The next thing you want to do once you're done testing out your connector is add descriptions and friendly names to help users understand the operations that you've made available. The next thing you can do is also enhance your connector functionality and add more capabilities to it. When you're enhancing your connector for Microsoft Flow, another thing that you can do is you can add dynamic values and dynamic schema, which provides a better experience for the users and the designer. So for example, if you want to show the list of SharePoint libraries in SharePoint, that can be a dynamic list that the user can then select from before they go ahead and create the rest of their flow. The other thing you can do is you can add triggers for Microsoft Flow using webhooks or polling. Now, when you're building an internal connector, you will go through the steps of basically developing your connector, testing it, and then you can share it with other users within your organization. And you don't have to share it with everybody. You can share it with a subgroup of people. For example, maybe you create a custom connector for the finance department, right? Well, maybe you don't want everybody in the company to have this connector or even see that it exists. So you can share using groups these connectors out to people such that only the people that should see them will see them. The next thing you can do if you're an ISV or an independent software developer is you can go ahead and certify your connector so that it's then consumable from the public. And like I said, that can help expose your platform or give your users more options to use some of the functionality in ways that maybe you haven't specifically programmed. Now let's talk about performance architecture when it comes to custom connectors. The first thing I want you to consider is avoiding connector sprawl. Now we can attribute this to Matthew Whitteman. In his blog, he talked about for PowerApps, app sprawl. And it applies here as well because you can go overboard and create too many connectors, right? You basically have unlimited options as far as the right sizing of connectors, the breadth and depth of your functionality that you provide in each connector. Now, you may decide, for example, to create several connectors for the same data source, depending on what your setup or your scenario might be. So, for example, maybe you have different parts of a particular API that you're consuming based on a group of users, and you only want to make a certain connector available to a subset group of users, but then you want to provide maybe another connector that has a different set of functionality to another group. Now, the key here is just don't go crazy, don't go overboard. The second thing I want you to consider is your implementation options, right? I want you to give more creative architectural thought to how you orchestrate connector data sources. The third thing is to design for load expectations. So design for scalability. Don't design for ease of implementation, right? Because it's always easy. Sometimes it's easy to do something, but it ultimately can come back to haunt you later after you go live. So when it comes to connector sprawl, one of the things you want to do is ask yourself, what is the level of functional granularity that makes sense for this connector? Now, just because an API exposes, hundreds of different operations, that doesn't mean you need to put them in your connector. You can focus your connector to meet a specific purpose and just keep your connector narrowly focused on that particular thing, which, maybe that's, just a couple operations that you provide. The other thing you need to ask is, how do you right size that connector functionality, right? Because you can go overboard, right? You may say to yourself, hey, this API I'm consuming, it does these things. Here's the things that the users really need. But hey, maybe it might be nice if we do this. And you just keep going, right? And I would say start with what you need based on existing requirements, and then based on user feedback, or maybe your business analyst says something to you, you can add more. But I would say try to keep it concise, have as much as necessary, but don't go overboard and have 50 million different operations that are available. Then the next question you can ask yourself is, how many connectors are too many, right? Like if a user goes in, let's say they're going to create a Microsoft Flow, and they go in to select the list of connectors, and like it's just like pages and pages and pages of connectors. To me, it seems like it would be a bad user experience. So you just have to figure out what makes sense. Now, also the other part of that is the security, right? You don't have to show every single connector to every single user. So just make sure that you're only showing the necessary connectors for a particular user group. That should help users not have to sort through dozens of connectors that they maybe don't need. And then the next question, of course, going back to the security, is what users should see what connectors. If you have connectors, for example, to the finance department and someone is in the sales department, do they really need to see those? You know, maybe you shouldn't expose those to every single user. Even if they don't have the credentials to log into that system, I think it's just good practice just to make sure that people only see the connectors they need to see. As far as implementation options, I mentioned previously that there is an on-premises gateway for these connectors, and you can definitely go ahead and use that. And what happens is you have to configure that connector such that it is using, and you have to set it up in Azure to notify it that, hey, this is to be used by this gateway, which is registered, and it will then proxy send those requests down to the gateway. The thing that I really want you to consider is the volume, right? Now, maybe it doesn't make sense to use a connector for your scenario, right? If it's something large or it depends. Don't just go and use a connector just because it's easy. Use it because it makes sense for the scenario that you're trying to enable. And if it doesn't fit, there are other options that you can use. For example, you can use an Azure partitioning strategy. So for example, let's say you have a big data set that's on-prem. Instead of creating a custom connector that uses an on-premises gateway, synchronize that table to maybe SQL Azure or something like that, and have your connector connect to the SQL Azure instance instead of the on-prem instance. That may make more sense depending on your scenario. Another pattern that you can use with custom connectors is the cache aside pattern, which I mentioned in another podcast under the name of proxy cache, but it's actually the cache aside pattern. And this is where, for example, you create an API. Let's say in Azure, you create an API app, and you then have that API app connect to something on-prem. And every time a user queries some particular data item, that data gets cached in a local cache and up in Azure. So that what that does is it can relieve the load. Now it depends on how users are querying the data, but it can relieve the load to where it's not always having to go on-prem. It can cache data up in Azure for a period of time. Another strategy that you can use is an Azure API app with a VPN tunnel or with ExpressRoute. For example, let's say you have an Azure API app and your connector is connecting to the Azure API app. The API app is then going through the VPN tunnel down to on-prem to collect whatever data the user has requested, and it returns that back. Now, I don't particularly like this pattern because there's a lot of points of failure, and there's the latency of connecting from the user to your cloud service or your Power App or whatever it is, then back to on-prem, then back from on-prem to online, then back to the user. Like I said, I really don't like this particular pattern just because it is not really set up for high workloads or high volume transactions. The other thing you can do is you could set up an enterprise application gateway that does have some ports exposed to the custom connector. This is typically a problem when it comes to the security team because they do not want to open up firewall ports, and I don't blame them. So this is probably not a pattern that you will likely use with any sizable organization with a security team. When you're designing for load expectations, there's a few things that you should consider. If you're connecting your service to a third-party API, you do have to consider what their API call limits might be. So if, for example, you have an API key that you've been given, services that allow you to access their API will block you after you call them too many times because, well, number one, they're trying to balance the load of their system, but it also prevents you from DOSing them or denial of service attacking them by having a sudden surge of calls coming through. The other thing that you should take into consideration is the latency of processing for the on-premises gateway. If your users are expecting an immediate result. You will get variable performance based on an on-premises gateway. That's just the nature of the architecture. Microsoft can't guarantee processing latency of the on-premises gateway because they can't predict, what your particular conditions might be or traffic going over the internet or your local network traffic or the data source that you're connecting to. So I just say this to say, be mindful that you could run into some issues, especially in high volume scenarios. Another thing that you should consider if you have a global deployment of users, the geo-distributed user latency that you could run into. For example, let's say you have a connector and that connector connects to an on-premises data source that is in the US, but the user happens to be in Australia. Well, guess what? You still have to make the hop across the internet from the user to the Azure data center to the on-prem, back to the Azure data center, back to the user. So as you can imagine, that may sound pretty ugly, and it is, because that is not going to provide a really good user experience. So what I would say in this kind of scenario, you probably have to come up with a more creative use case, or you have to somehow cache the data to where it's being able to be served up faster to the user. So for example, if this global distribution scenario, the users in Australia, depending on your scenario of what it is that you're trying to get to the user, maybe you use something like Cosmos DB. You shoot the data up to Cosmos DB and you have it set to replicate out to an Australian data center. And that user is using a custom connector that connects to the data source in the local Cosmos DB data center instead of coming all the way to the US to do that. Now, it depends on your scenario. There's a lot of ways you can do that. That's just one idea that you can do. The other thing that you have to consider is the scalability of your on-premises gateways for the custom connector. So if you set up one server with an on-premises gateway and you have 10,000 users banging away at it, don't expect that you're going to get great performance. You're going to have to manage the load or the scalability of your on-premises gateway servers. If, for example, you have, let's just say, for example, you have 3 servers, right? Are 3 servers going to be enough for your load scenario? Good question, right? Well, if you don't ask this up front, you could find yourself one day getting that phone call on the red phone from your boss saying, I need you in my office right now. We've got problems. So another thing you want to do is make sure that you scale out your gateway servers sufficiently, not only to enable high availability, but also to be able to manage the load coming through. The next thing I want you to consider is the user experience and the user expectations. Like I said, if you're using an on-premises gateway, you could run into some latency challenges where users press a button or they run a workflow and they're expecting a result fairly quickly, and that result does not materialize fast enough for them. You may get complaints. As I mentioned previously, there's other ways you can go around to make this experience better. It just depends. If it's an asynchronous thing that a user kicks off, fine, it doesn't matter. And it actually works better for asynchronous operations when you're using the on-premises gateway. But if you're trying to do something synchronously, you're asking for trouble. The other thing that you have to consider with custom connectors is ad hoc versus embedded usage scenarios. So for example, is the connector going to be used in something that a user will manually kick off, as opposed to maybe you have some kind of embedded app in a model-driven app, for example, and every time a user goes and opens up a form or something, is this thing getting kicked off somehow? And that could be very dangerous if you don't understand how it's going to be used. Biggest challenge with custom connectors is if you create this custom connector to a data source and it's just out there, for example, in Power Platform, and it can be used in PowerApps and Flow. The challenge is you don't know, maybe today you know how that connector will be used. You don't know how it will be used tomorrow. You don't know what apps may be created tomorrow by other teams or by other users, or what users may decide to create a flow with that adapter. And to me, that's a little scary, because with the whole democratization of IT comes a lot of variability and unpredictability. And so when you create this connector, maybe you create this connector to, call some dingy little service somewhere that maybe it's not load balanced. Maybe it's just not, you don't expect it to be used a lot, right? Today, maybe that's true. Tomorrow could be a whole different story. So you just have to kind of keep an eye out and understand what's being used, why it's being used, where it could go in the future, and how do you plan for scalability, and how do you plan for making sure your user expectations are going to be met. Well, that about wraps it up for custom connectors for the Power Platform. I hope that this information becomes useful to you sometime in the future, and you will keep that in your toolbox for a rainy day and use it where it makes sense.
Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. Feel free to reach out and connect with me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Stephan Smith CRM, and that's STEPHAN. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Stephan Smith CRM as well. And feel free to check out my website, and that's dynamicsmechanics.com. Thank you.